Hello, and welcome to the fourth Line Unbroken first stage card review. Here we are looking at the tactics cards from the first stage set. So let us begin with the heroes.
Okay, our first hero then is Fingolfin, who is an 11 threat hero with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 4 defense, 6 hit points. The Noldor, House of Fingolfin and Noble traits. Sentinel, and action. Raise your threat by 3 to choose an enemy in play. Engage the chosen enemy. Until the end of the round, Fingolfin does not exhaust to defend against the chosen enemy.
Now in the story, Fingolfin was the High King of the Noldor after Feanor died, and his most notable thing that he did was that after a fairly disastrous battle against the forces of Morgoth, where many died and were driven from their lands, he, thinking that they were all doomed, charged off to Angband and challenged Morgoth to single combat, which it says Morgoth didn't really want to face him in single combat, but didn't dare lose face in front of all his captains and commanders. And then there is this excerpt, which I'll read. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth, whence smoke and fire darted. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away, as a lightning shoots from under a dark cloud, and he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the hosts of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at the last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all rent and pitted about him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, and the weight of it was like a fallen hill. Yet with his last and desperate stroke Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringil, and the blood gushed forth black and smoking and filled the pits of Grond. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old. And it goes on to explain that the wounds Fingolfin gave to Morgoth never healed. So, as far as the mechanics go, there is a very, very obvious comparison in the official card pool, which is Beregond.
Basically, yes. Super defender with 4 defense. In this case, though, it's 6 hit points, not just 4.
Yes, and 1 willpower, which, of course, all heroes in the first stage have at least 1 willpower, probably because of corruption.
On the other hand, of course, a very different ability to Beregond.
Yep, it is an interesting one. It's one that I often forget that he has, because he's kind of worth it just for the stat line, just as Beregond is, to be honest. Even if you had to pay for his attachments, you'd still play him just for the 4 defense. As Beregond, he does have his particular toys in the attachments, which we'll get to. But then that ability, although it is one you can often pass over, it is actually very useful under certain circumstances. Obviously, as the tactics player, you may have the most attack power, so you can pull enemies that other players have engaged that you are able to kill and they're not, which is handy because there's very little ranged in the first stage. But of course you can also use that ability to pull enemies out of the staging area, which can get you more progress during questing, because you remove their threat from the staging area. And the fact that Fingolfin then does not exhaust to defend the enemy allows you to get multiple uses out of him. So you can pull down an enemy and he can defend it without exhausting, and then he can defend another enemy by exhausting, engage with you or with another player since he has Sentinel. And getting multiple defenses out of your 4 defense, 6 hit point Sentinel is worth a lot. The threat may mount up, but it's probably worth it.
Related note, unless this has been errated from the version I'm looking at, there's one important thing that isn't on that ability.
Yes, there is no limit. If you want, you can raise your threat by 3 times however many enemies are in play and engage all of them and not exhaust to defend any of them. You probably don't want to take literally all of them, but yeah. Which particularly adds to the value of the taking enemies out of the staging area to get more quest progress, because if you want, you can just take all of the enemies. So, yeah, other than the ability, he's a very straightforward hero, the ability also can be very useful. Let's move on to our second hero, Hirin.
Yes. Hirin's an 8 threat cost hero with 2 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense, 4 hit points, the Edine, House of Hador and Warrior traits, and his text reads, Hirin gets +1 attack for each enemy engaged with you.
And in the story, his most notable bit in the story was in the 5th great battle against Morgoth, which I'll just read an excerpt here. Last of all, Hurin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield and wielded an axe two-handed. And it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard of Gothmog until it withered. And each time that he slew, Hurin cried, Arre Entuluva, day shall come again! 70 times he uttered that cry, but they took him at last alive by the command of Morgoth. So, 70 times while fighting hordes of orcs and trolls, he killed and just kept going, which is fairly epic, and very much matches the ability. Gets more dangerous the more enemies you have. Now, the natural comparison with Hurin is to all of the Dunedain cards from the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle, which gain benefits for the number of enemies engaged with you. And so, as with Haleth as well, all the same sorts of things apply. You can power them up if you have lots of strong defenders, or combat tricks, or forest snares. Now, clearly, Hurin benefits from readying. He has 2 willpower, which is respectable, 3 if Finrod Felagund is in play, so you could quest with him, but also you quite possibly want to engage multiple enemies and get multiple attacks to kill all of them, in which case you want to be careful what order you do your attacks in, because his attack value will be steadily dropping as you kill them.
However, of course, it should always be at least 3, because, after all,
he has effectively a minimum attack of 3, because you have to be engaged with at least 1 enemy in order to attack it.
It's also worth noting, of course, he has the general all-rounder stat line.
Yeah.
For that matter, so he is also a potential defender in an emergency.
Yep. But yes, it's notable, of course, that effectively you could consider him to be a minimum of 2/3, 2/4, but this has no effect on his threat cost. In fact, his threat cost is a -2 compared to his stats. We forgot to mention Fingolfin is the standard -1. But yes, so for 8 threat, you get 2/3, 2/4, possibly more than that, if you can engage a lot of enemies. So Hurin is just pretty solid and cheap. Onto Excellion.
Okay. Excellion is an 11 threat cost hero with 1 willpower, 4 attack, 3 defense, 4 hit points, the Noldor and warrior traits, and his text reads, when Excellion attacks alone, the defending enemy does not count its defense.
And Ecthelian's big moment in the story is that when Gondolin was falling, he fought Gothmog, captain of the Balrogs, alone, and they both died in the battle. So, mechanics-wise, the natural comparison is to the Mirkwood Runner, which also doesn't count enemy defense when it attacks alone, but the Mirkwood Runner only has 2 attack, whereas Excellion has the, until Feanor, unprecedented 4. So that's an incredibly powerful ability with 4 attack. The number of enemies with 4 hit points compared to the number with 2 is somewhat more impressive.
Yes, although the first age has some relatively tough enemies.
Yes.
So.
Yes, you obviously have to consider with Excellion, under some circumstances, it's a question of, do I make use of his ability, or do I have other characters chip in so that then I have to overcome the defense, but maybe I can actually kill the enemy in 1 hit? On the other hand, if you can increase Ecthelian's attack, then maybe you can kill the enemy in 1 hit and have all your other characters able to do other things.
The catch with that is that it isn't immediately easy to raise Excellian's attack.
Yes, a lot of the attack-boosting attachments from the official card pool are not on the First Age approved list. So there are a few. The Blade of Gondolin, which of course is very thematic since Excellion was a captain in Gondolin. If you're fighting orcs, that will work. If you pair him with Mastery, Madness of Rage,
7 attack will kill a lot of things.
Yes, if you're
bypassing defense.
If you can somehow find a unique weapon that you can attach to him, then you could use Dark Heart of the Smith, though he only has 1 willpower and there are no such unique weapons. But if one turns up at some point, then you could do that. Support of the Eagles are on the approved list, so you could use that to boost his attack, or the more recently released Elven Spear. Obviously, you have to discard cards to get the attack boost, But if you're able to do some discarding, then that works out fine because you can discard exactly the number that you need.
The one other thing I'd mention about Excellion is that despite obviously you focus on his attack capabilities, because 4 attack obviously and the ignoring defense bit, but he's also a potentially versatile hero because he's actually a fairly credible defender with 3 defense and 4 hit points. So you might plan on using him as an attacker, but I think particularly in the early game, then it's it's not irrelevant to have an extra defender and one who will survive for a while.
Potentially, if you have an enemy that Excellion can't kill in one hit, maybe you could defend with him and have some of your allies deal a small amount of damage to it so that next round he can kill it in one hit. Especially if your allies would not survive the attack. Because then, if you're going to chump block, then it's probably better if you only have to chump block once and the other is defended by Excellion, rather than having to chump block twice to get in the kill.
Yes, that makes sense.
And again, Excellion has the standard -1 threat discount. So moving on to the allies. Our first ally is Thorin Door. Thorin Door is a unique 5-cost ally with 2 willpower, 4 attack, 1 defense, 4 hit points. He has the creature, eagle, and noble traits. He cannot have restricted attachments, and reads Response. After you play Thorin Door from your hand, put a character from any player's discard pile into play under its owner's control.
The first immediate comparisons are things like Landreval or Fortune or Fate, because it's not simply something that can revive allies, but can revive heroes.
Yes.
Indeed, comparing to Fortune or Fate, Thorin Door costs exactly the same and also provides you with that stat line for basically the same effect, because...
Yep. And then comparing to Landreval, you have to remove him from play to gain the benefit, whereas Thorin Door, you actually put him into play. And thus, well, of course, it only works after you play him from hand. You cannot sneak attack him to revive your heroes. But if you pay those 5 tactics resources, then you get a dead hero back. Or, of course, you can also do it with allies, if things are going well and your heroes aren't dying. All in all, I mean, it's a very worthwhile stat line. 4 attack is obviously very good. He can soak up some direct damage. He can quest for 2 if you want, though you probably want the 4 attack more. Nothing really bad to say about this.
No,
it's very thematic as well. Thorin Door had kind of a habit of picking up significant characters before they died and carrying them away.
Significant and appropriate representation of the Father of Eagles.
Yep.
Moving on, however, our next ally is the Gondolin Guard, which is a 2-cost ally with 0 willpower, 1 attack, 4 defense, 1 hit point, and the Sentinel keyword.
So this, again, have to note, only 0 willpower, so very vulnerable to corruption, but it's very, very easy to see the comparison to the official card pool in the Defender of Ramas, which it's not one of those things where Ian looked at something that didn't work and made it work. It's clearly one where he looked at something and was like, I want this to still exist.
The only notable difference is the Sentinel keyword, which of course adds that extra little amount of power to it.
Yep. And there's really not much else to say. It's a very simple card. You get 4 defense and Sentinel for a 2-cost ally. It's incredibly good. So, we move on to Huan. Huan is a unique 4-cost ally with 1 willpower, 4 attack, 1 defense, 4 hit points, and the Hound trait. He reads, Action. Huan gets +5 attack until the end of the phase. At the end of the phase in which you trigger this effect, discard Huan. Limit once per round. And action, attach Huan to Baron or Luthien. Counts as a mount attachment with the text. While attached hero is committed to the quest, deal 2 damage to each enemy revealed during staging.
Well, the obvious comparison is Ally Bjorn.
For the first ability, yes.
For the first ability, yes.
Of course, Ally Bjorn is shuffled into your deck rather than discarded.
Exactly. Equally, Ally Bjorn has less attack total when either using the ability or not. But then Ally Bjorn also has a good defense and a big hit point pool, so more versatility.
Yeah, Huan is much more of a one-trick hound.
Of course,
Bjorn can defend or attack. Whereas Huan is pretty much just going to maybe take some direct damage on that 4 hit points, but mostly just attack for 4 and then eventually for 9.
Yes.
Unless you trigger the second action. And, I mean, with 4 attack, that's pretty useful, so you have to possibly weigh up whether you want to have that 4 attack around consistently or just deal 2 damage to everything as it appears, so long as it's not immune to player card effects.
Since most enemies revealed from the encounter deck in any setup tend not to be immune to player card effects.
Yeah. So, I mean, that obviously the comparison is Tharlin, except it's doubled, and that is incredibly powerful.
Also, it's Tharlin's ability stuck on either Beren or Luthien, both of whom are likely to be questing anyway because they
3 or 5 willpower.
Yes.
The attachment option actually combos very well with Excellion. If you have enemies that have more than 4 hit points, up to 6, then any such enemy will die in 1 hit to Excellion. Personally, when I first started using him, I tended to favour using him as an ally, but I've come round to actually preferring using him as the mount attachment more recently.
Yes, well,
I think the blanket 2 damage.
Clearly haven't used him enough. Then the one other point I was going to make a little while back when we were comparing him to Bjorn, it's also worth noting, of course, he is cheaper than ally Bjorn.
Yes.
So, which 4 resources is obviously feels quite a bit more affordable than 6.
Yeah, and it's equal resources to attack.
Moving on then, our next ally is Hugh, who is a unique 3-cost ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, 3 hit points, the Edine, House of Hador, and warrior traits, and the text, Hugh may be assigned damage from undefended attacks.
So Hugh, incidentally, is Hurin's father. Or
Brother.
No, brother, yes. I always get that wrong. Yes, obviously, as an Edine ally, he works well with Finrod, so he can quest for 2 instead of 1. And the ability to take undefended attacks naturally gives you action advantage. I mean, that's generally the reason that you take an undefended attack. It's either because all your heroes are already exhausted, or it's so that they can remain ready and attack afterwards.
The comparison I would make, to some extent, is to the White Tower Watchman.
Yep.
Because...
Yes,
again,
very much so.
Same cost for the same ability, and I believe...
Almost the same stat line, plus 1 attack. But otherwise it's the same.
Yes. Unique, which the White Tower Watchman isn't, but then, of course, the White Tower Watchman, you need to be playing Monosphere.
Then also, it's worth noting that, like the White Tower Watchman, he has that 2 defense and 3 hit points, so potentially you can gain even more action advantage by having him defend 1 attack and then take an undefended attack. So you've covered 2 attacks with 1 ally, and then he dies and you can play another copy. You can also possibly, if you're just taking an undefended attack anyway, then you can choose to not put the damage on him and put it on a hero to save his hit points for later use if it's a weak undefended. But then if it gets boosted by a shadow effect, he's there. Or if you have access to leadership, you can take an undefended attack knowing that if it gets boosted to a point where it will kill your hero, you can just sneak attack him in to take it instead. If there are any ways of boosting his hit points, then that also helps, and then you can hopefully heal him up afterwards. But I'm looking at the approved list here, and Ent Draft does not appear to be on it. And that's the only way I could think of to increase the hit points of an ally. But if there's anything in the future that would increase the hit points, then that would work. So then our next ally is Ascal. He's a unique 4-cost ally with 1 willpower, 3 attack, 2 defense, 4 hit points. He has the dwarf and warrior traits, and reads Response. After Ascal is destroyed as the result of an enemy attack, deal 3 damage to the attacking enemy.
He's actually got a pretty good stat line for his cost.
Yep.
In fact,
it's versatile. He can attack for 3, he can defend a bit without dying, and then he can defend and die and trigger his ability to deal the damage. The natural comparison in the official card pool is a card from very recently in the Flight of the Stormcaller adventure pack, Last Stand, which, if you don't know, is a 0-cost event that when a warrior is destroyed, you deal damage to the enemy equal to their attack. Ascal just has that built in. I suppose if Last Stand is added to the approved list, you could in theory combo the 2 to deal 6 direct damage when he dies, but it's pretty useful just at 3, and in the meantime you get the stats. The other obvious point to mention is that as a dwarf, you have to consider him if you're considering using Nauglamir. I would say that when I was talking about Nauglamir in the Mastery review, I did say that maybe if you want to just keep one dwarf in play, you can spend one resource around. I'd say Ascal is reasonably worth it if he's going to be your one dwarf, and eventually you're going to kill him off anyway. So that could be reasonable if you're using no other dwarves.
Okay, that rounds out the allies. So the first attachment then is Oath of Vengeance, which is a 2-cost attachment with the Oath trait, and it reads, attached to a hero, limit 1 per hero. Response, after a character you control is destroyed, place 1 resource on Oath of Vengeance. And action, spend 1 resource from Oath of Vengeance to give attached hero +1 willpower or +1 attack until the end of the phase.
Now, the biggest difficulty I've had with this in the past is the fact that it's only characters you control. So you have to have this, and you have to have a strategy which runs on chump blocking a lot of the time, which often doesn't happen because tactics has good defenders like Fingolfin and the Gondolin Guard, so they just survive and you never actually get resources on your Oath of Vengeance. Which, particularly since it costs 2 to get it into play in the first place, it doesn't necessarily work out so well. It might work better if it was in a different sphere. Certainly, I suppose you could use it with possibly Excellion or Hirin, where Excellion can be a decent defender, Hirin can be a passable defender, but you don't really want to use them for that. So maybe you pair one of those two with a different sphere that is more likely to have its allies die.
Yes, well, I was thinking using it with Excellion works because obviously anything that can boost Excellion's attack is useful. And in theory, while you'd be doing it kind of one at a time, you could spend any number of resources to get any amount of attack boost from the Oath of Vengeance. It is just limited by the jump blocking thing, and I'm not sure that there are enough allies to get a reliable boost out of it.
Yeah, it's also notable that it is flexible. You can get willpower or attack. Perhaps one of the best combinations might be with Erendil, because then you can boost his willpower with it and give him Vingalot so he can actually use that willpower in combat. And potentially you also have Elwing, who you can use as a chump and pay 1 spirit resource to bring her back and put a resource on the Oath of Vengeance. But it's a lot of moving parts to get it to work. And finally, of course, it works with Hold to the Oath, where you get a bonus for having an oath attached. Our next attachment is Ringil. It is a unique 2-cost attachment with the item and weapon traits. It reads, attached to a hero with the House of Fingolfin trait. Restricted. Attached hero gets +1 attack, +2 if Fingolfin. If the attached hero is Fingolfin, Ringil gains Response. After the attached character attacks alone, cancel all damage from that attack and reduce your threat by that amount instead. And Ringil is, of course, Fingolfin's sword. You may remember I mentioned it in the excerpt that I read for Fingolfin.
One of the things that I would say is, personally, I'm not sure if it's worth it on any character who isn't Fingolfin, for starters. Because 2 resources for 1 point of attack is...
it's sort of comparable to the core set Dwarven Axe, only more limited, where if you put the Dwarven Axe on anyone who is not a dwarf, it's 2 resources for 1 attack. On a dwarf, it's 2 for 2, and it's the same here. If you put it on not Fingolfin, it's only 1 attack. On Fingolfin, it's 2 attack. And an extra ability which you might use.
It's very restricted in who you can place it on as well, because I was just checking, the only other character with the House of Fingolfin trait we've mentioned so far has been Fingon, who has 1 attack at base.
There are 2 more who are lore heroes, 1 with 2 attack and 1 with 1 attack.
Yes, so really 2 resources to give any of them 1 more attack isn't doing that much. Now on Fingolfin, of course, it gets him up to 3 attack total, because after all he's
from his base of 1.
Yes. However, of course, since you can raise your threat for Fingolfin's ability and not have to exhaust to defend, then he's got that potential sort of inbuilt action advantage.
Yes. And you can potentially use the response on Ringil to cancel out the threat raise, but that has the proviso that Fingolfin has to attack alone to trigger it, which reduces the amount of damage you'll do, which reduces the amount you'll get to reduce your threat, and also the enemy is still alive and you have to deal with it again in a subsequent round. So it's potentially difficult to actually get a lot of use out of that. It should be noted that Ringil is a unique weapon, so you can trigger Dark Heart of the Smith with it. And indeed, I suppose that would work with the response. You would double the damage that he deals, and then cancel that doubled damage and reduce your threat by that amount. So maybe that's a way to make it work, but he only has 1 willpower, so the amount that you can corrupt him is obviously limited.
Okay, next attachment then, Rushalor. It's a unique 2-cost attachment with the Mount trait that reads, attached to Fingolfin. Combat action. Choose an enemy in the staging area. Exhaust Rushalor and the attached hero to make an attack on that enemy. The attached hero gets +1 attack, +2 attack if the enemy is unique.
So Rushalor is Fingolfin's horse. The difficulty of using this is, of course, that you have to keep enemies in staging into the combat phase. It potentially combos with Ringil, I suppose, because it gives Fingolfin a bit more attack when he does it, so you're more likely to do some damage, and then that allows you to lower your threat, which makes it easier to keep the enemies in the staging area. On the other hand, it works contrary to Fingolfin's actual ability, which raises your threat to take enemies out of the staging area, so you're kind of being pulled in 2 different directions there.
One of the things I would say is that obviously we know the official cards have things like Dunhir and Haldir who can attack into the staging area.
Yes.
And I would say Fingolfin to some extent doesn't have enough attack to really make use of that, because that kind of strategy works usually by trying to immediately kill off enemies in the staging area without having to engage them. With Fingolfin, his base attack is only 1. So even if you get him Ringil and Rushalor, then that's 4 or 5 attack total, which
and there are
won't kill most
limited
enemies.
number of other attack boosts you can give him.
Exactly. And equally, your threat is likely to be too high to keep enemies in the staging area. So...
where Dunhir and Haldir have threat costs of 8 and 9, Fingolfin is 11, and then his ability, if you ever want to use it, will raise your threat further. So it's limited how much you'll actually be able to do this. Obviously, it does work if there are shadow effects that return enemies to the staging area, but a lot of the time this is just going to be too much effort to actually make it work. Our next attachment is one which may seem very familiar. It is the Blue Shield. It is a unique 1-cost attachment with the item and armor traits. It reads, attached to a hero with the House of Fingolfin trait, restricted. Attached hero gets +1 defense, +2 defense if the attached hero is Fingolfin.
Now, the obvious comparison is, of course, the Gondorian Shield, because it
is the Gondorian Shield.
Yeah, except it's unique and much more restricted on who it can actually be played on. On the other hand, while we were picking out Ringil being not necessarily an ideal pick for the other House of Fingolfin heroes, we said Fingon has 2 defense, and we've already mentioned there are
the 2 lore heroes with the House of Fingolfin trade. One of them has 3 defense, and one has 1.
Yeah, which means that there are at least 2 other out-of-sphere heroes where 1 resource for 1 defense wouldn't be useless.
Yeah, but it's best if you put it on Fingolfin, get him to 6 defense and 6 hit points.
Which is basically
Sentinel.
Which is basically doing the Baragon thing.
There's not much more to it. It's an incredibly useful card so long as you can put it on someone who will be defending, most likely Fingolfin. Moving on, one more attachment.
Yes, our final attachment is the Dragon Helm, which is a unique 3-cost attachment with the item, armor, and artifact traits, and it reads, attached to a hero with the House of Hador trait, restricted. Response, after attached hero is damaged, exhaust Dragon Helm and raise your threat by 3 to cancel all damage from that attack. And if attached hero is Thorin, Dragon Helm gains response. After an enemy engages with you, it gets -1 attack and -1 defense until the end of the round.
The Dragon Helm was an heirloom of the House of Hador, so it obviously is appropriate that it can only be attached to the House of Hador, which practically means Hirin or Thorin.
Yes, this is one I have made some good use of with Thorin in particular. You could do this part of it with Thorin, obviously, because the extra reducing enemies' attack and defense when they engage you is useful, but the big thing you're looking at is the ability to essentially take undefended attacks, and presumably they will be undefended attacks as threats.
And that is the thing, and as only 3 threats, not equal to the attack, like if you used Frodo Baggins in the official content. And, of course, taking undefended attacks and raising your threat are both things that you expect to happen with Thorin, because you use his first ability to raise your threat and his second ability to take undefended attacks by discarding your allies. So this just plays into what you are probably going to be doing anyway.
Yes. The only things I would note with actually using it with Thorin is that you might want to actually see it equally in a multiplayer context, because pairing Thorin up with tactics is obviously useful, but you won't necessarily have the threat reduction to keep your threat actually under control from using the Dragon Helm and his ability.
Also, I mean, you definitely don't want to run a solo deck that's Thorin and tactics, because you won't have the willpower.
No.
Putting Thorin and 2 tactics heroes is a thing that I've done. It makes you a very, very focused combat deck, which I would say is ideal in 3 or 4 players, even not even 2.
Yes. The one point that can kind of work for using it in a solo context is actually playing it by way of Feanor.
Yes.
Because that way you don't
have to have lots of tactics resources.
No, or indeed any.
Yes.
Because you could stick it into a deck using Feanor, Thorin, and a Spirit hero, so you've got threat reduction, and then you can only play the Dragon Helm through Feanor's ability, but you were kind of planning on that, and it can work very well, and it's, again, as a 3-cost card, it's a lot easier to just afford 1 corruption on Feanor rather than stacking up 3 resources.
But it should also be noted, though, that if you're doing a Mastery Spirit thing with your Thorin and some Spirit for all the threat reduction, you can still get the Dragon Helm where if you use Mormagil, Thorin gains a tactics icon, or Aranruth, he can have any icon he wants, which can include tactics.
Yes.
So we move on to the events with Undismayed. Undismayed is a 1-cost event which reads Response. After a character is destroyed by an enemy attack, put that character back into play. That character gets +3 attack and is discarded at the end of the phase.
The first thing I thought when I read that was using it with Ascal. Because...
that's my first note that I have as well.
Because, of course, Ascal has that very useful ability when he is destroyed, and then just pay 1 resource for Undismayed, and he comes back into play with 6 attack, which means that if the direct damage didn't kill off whichever enemy just killed him, he might be able to finish the job anyway.
So that works. Vassal of the Windlord is another possibility I considered, because it has 3 attack. You have to discard it after it attacks anyway.
Yes.
And sometimes you might want to just use it as a chump blocker. So you can have it defend as a chump, dies, play Undismayed for another 1 resource to bring it back with 6 attack, and it attacks once and is discarded, which it would have been anyway, according to Undismayed. The final combo that occurred to me when looking at this was with the leadership event Flame Light Flee Knight, which allows you to take an Edine ally out of your deck. They don't exhaust to quest, attack, or defend until the end of the round and are discarded at the end of the round. So then you quest with them, you defend with them, you possibly defend multiple times with them, and eventually they die. You play Undismayed, they come back, and they still don't exhaust to attack, because it's still not the end of the round.
I think that follows, since...
I suppose it's debatable whether you consider them the same, but it's...
Well, it does say put that character back into play.
It's acknowledging that it's the same character.
Yes.
So I think they still get the boost from Flame Light Flee Knight and don't exhaust to attack. So they get that +3 attack and can attack as many times as you want, as many times as you have enemies.
Yes.
And then they get discarded, which they were going to be anyway.
Yeah, the other things I would say is, of course, in utter emergencies, you could use Undismayed on a hero. If you've had an unexpected hero death, particularly towards the end of a game, then...
Yeah, if a boss enemy kills one of your heroes, you can bring them back to kill the boss, And then, I mean, if you win the game by killing the boss, then you actually don't even need to discard them.
No.
Because you win first. But
Yes.
either way, so long as you win.
The other thing I'd say is what I wouldn't normally use it for is chump blocking with standard, really weak chump blockers, because
they tend not to have a lot of attack.
Exactly. So
Though +3
means
does that anything
help.
has
Yes.
decent attack.
That's true.
Just 3 is good.
That is true.
And it does effectively give you action advantage if they defend and then die and come back ready with 3 more attack.
Yes. Our next event is Feast of Reuniting, which is a 3-cost event that reads, Action. All characters gain ranged and sentinel until the end of the phase.
It should be noted that there is very limited ranged and sentinel in the first stage otherwise. Fingolfin has sentinel, the Gondolin Guard has sentinel, and there is 1 ranged ally in lore with 1 attack that you probably want to use for its ability anyway. And then there are a few things on the approved list. So in general, you're not going to see a lot of ranged and sentinels, which increases their value effectively.
I think one of the biggest problems with it is it's in that awkward 3-cost spot.
It is costly, but it's potentially a very big effect because, well, I mean, how many times do we have that situation where you have heroes ready for combat, but all the enemies are engaged with 1 player and the other guys not being ranged are just sitting there doing nothing? So if you can play this, then everyone can chip in with defense or attack. Works, obviously, especially if you have readying effects to allow heroes to do multiple things each round.
Yes.
Our next event is Banners and Horns. It is a 1-cost event which reads Response. After a unique ally you control enters play, choose any non-unique enemy in play. That enemy gets -X attack and -X defense until the end of the round. X is equal to the cost of that ally.
Well, the first thing I know I thought when I looked at that was it looks kind of tricky to make it work, because after all, you need to have the resources to play an ally, you need to have both the ally and the event in your hand, and you need an enemy to be in play.
Yeah.
Which
It's a 2-card combo. You need the enemy to be there. You need the resources to play the ally and the event.
And there's also, of course, that fact that you often will think you kind of want an expensive ally to get a really good effect out of it.
But then saving up that many resources and an extra 1 for the event, and possibly there might be other things that you want to save up for.
Exactly.
Like if you have a feint in your hand, maybe you want that as well.
Yes. However, I think we both realised there's 1 or 2 really useful combo plays.
Before we get to those, I will just mention that there are plenty of unique allies if you want to trigger this. Without delving into the approved list, there are 4 unique allies in leadership, 5 in spirit, 7 in mastery, 4 in tactics, 3 in lore, and 1 neutral in first stage. But then, yes, shenanigans. Banners and Horns reads, after a unique ally you control enters play, not after you play it from your hand.
So first and foremost, sneak attack.
Exactly.
Which gets around a lot of the things I was saying about not just the cost problem, because obviously, I mean, you still need a multi-card combo to set this up.
Yep, it's now become a 3-card combo,
But obviously you bypass the cost issue. You also bypass one of the things I mentioned about timing, because during the planning phase, you might not have an enemy in play that you want to actually reduce in power.
But if you sneak attack an ally for the combat phase, then obviously you know the enemy is there, and this is why you're doing it. Other possibilities, I will note that Elfstone is on the approved list, so if you attach that to the active location, you can bring in an ally after questing, at which point you can see all the enemies that are in play this round, and choose if you want to target one. It also works with a Rodreth. A Rodreth, of course, also works with sneak attack, as we mentioned, so there's that possibility that you sneak attack a Rodreth for the quest phase, and then he leaves play and you put him back into play after you've seen all the enemies that have come out, so you know what you want to hit with Banners and Horns for 4. Or, if you have Finduilas in play, Finduilas takes an undefended attack and dies, and you put a Rodreth into play and play Banners and Horns once again. And one last one which occurred to me was Elwing. where if Erendil is in play, after Elwing is destroyed by an enemy attack, you can pay 1 spirit resource to put her back into play, at which point she has just entered play again, and so you can play Banners and Horns to reduce an enemy by 3. So there are definitely some powerful combos that you can put together if you want to do this. If you want to get into really complicated, then maybe you go, okay, so I've got the Oath of Vengeance, and Elwing will defend, and so I'll spend a resource to put her back into play, put a resource on the Oath of Vengeance, and play Banners and Horns to debuff another enemy so that it will barely damage me and then I can kill it easily. But the fact is, there are a lot of ways that you can make this useful, a lot more than it may appear at first glance.
Our next event then is Strengthen the Watch, which is a zero-cost event, which reads, Encounter action. Exhaust a character. All enemies that engaged you this phase get -1 attack until the end of the round.
I've never really used this card.
No, I haven't.
I feel like it's not that powerful. If you have spare characters, yeah, it's good to reduce everything's attack, but you can't plan on having this available, so you have to assume that you'll need strong enough defenders anyway.
I think one of the things, I sometimes feel it's one of those cards that looks better in theory than in practice, because in theory you think, well, we've got this zero-cost event and at the cost of 1 exhaust, and we can debuff all the enemies that engage me, except the number of enemies that are going to engage you in a single round is not necessarily that high, and it's only that engage
1,
you.
maybe 2.
Yes.
Perhaps in a quest with lots of enemies and in a 4-player game, you're going to get a lot of enemies, and particularly if you're the highest threat player.
Yes. Another possibility, I'm going to need to just glance at the approved list a second.
Yes, the Hammerstroke is on the approved list.
So you could, in theory, play the Hammerstroke and then strengthen the watch.
Engage all enemies in play and reduce them all by 1.
Yeah, but the Hammerstroke's actually another case of a card that
How often are there enough enemies that you really need?
Exactly. I tend to find it's another card that does have that better in theory than in practice, because you look at it and go, yeah, I can pull this huge swarm of enemies, and assuming I have some way of defending them, then we can clear the board.
Yeah, so then maybe we're getting into seriously janky combo territory where it sounds really great of, okay, so I'll play the Hammerstroke to pull all the enemies, and then I'll play Thicket of Spears so none of them attack. I'll play Strengthen the Watch so they all have -1 attack. That's irrelevant if I'm playing Thicket of Spears. Never mind
which
that.
kind of...
Play the Hammerstroke. I'll play Strengthen the Watch so they all get -1 attack, and then I'll play Feast of Reuniting so everyone has Ranged and Sentinel. It sounds great, it just cost 5 resources and exhausting a character and 3 cards, and it's maybe going to be useful once in a game, possibly. So it's great in theory, but in practice it's not going to work that consistently.
Yes.
The next event is And Yet a Warning. It is a zero-cost event, which reads Response. After you attack and destroy an enemy, choose 1. Add 1 resource to the resource pool of a hero you control, draw 1 card, or lower your threat by 1.
The main thing I'd say is that is really an example of a kind of good, versatile tactics card, and clearly a tactics card because, like certain other tactics effects, you need to have enemies in play for it to be any use, and more to the point, you need to have enemies you can kill. And so there are some quests where that doesn't work out. One thing I realised is it's providing essentially a small bonus from any of the other 3 standard spheres, so not mastery, but essentially leadership for generating a resource, threat reduction, spirit, card draw is law. So
obviously it's cheap, costs 0, and it's flexible, but it's also not very powerful. If we compare to official cards, I suppose you can say add 1 resource is kind of like Wealth of Gondor, which is also a 0-cost event. Draw 1 card we could compare to We Are Not Idle, also a 0-cost card. Lower your threat by 1. I don't think there's anything that lowers your threat by 1. Everything lowers your threat by more than 1, and some of them also cost 0. So it helps a little bit, but it's not going to blow you away ever.
On the other hand, I'd say the fact that it is versatile...
Yeah, that's the thing that kind of saves it and means you may well put it in. The fact that you can use it for whatever you really need at the time. I think the resource might actually be the most effective Though the card is also good if you don't have much other card draw, which you may well not, because there are less weapons in the first stage than in the official content, so Foe Hammer is less reliable.
So in that context, and yet a warning, just one more card does sometimes help.
So, moving on to the final event.
Okay. Day Shall Come Again. A 1-cost event that reads, Response. After a character you control destroys an enemy, ready that character. That character gets +1 attack until the end of the round. You may pay 1 tactics resource to return Day Shall Come Again to your hand.
This obviously is referring again to Hurin's big moment when he kept shouting Day Shall Come Again 70 times as he killed things. It's also one of those cards where you sort of look at it and you imagine the ideal scenario where you have a massive stack of tactics resources. Maybe you've got High Kingship of the Noldor, or someone else has High Kingship of the Noldor and you have an Oath of Friendship so you can take all their resources. And so you also have a ton of engaged enemies, so Hurin attacks for a lot. And then you play Day Shall Come Again to ready him and pay another resource to return it to your hand. And Hurin still has the same attack that he started with because you've lost one enemy but added one for Day Shall Come Again. And then you just keep going and reenact that scene where he kills 70 enemies. But in practice, it's pretty much never going to happen. If you're engaged with 70 enemies, then you've done something weird to the encounter deck. But if you're engaged with more than, I don't know, 5 or 6 enemies, that's still pretty weird, because why haven't you killed them yet? But the thing is, you don't need the ideal scenario for it to be useful. If it lets you kill one more enemy, then that's worth it.
Actually, in that regard, I'm finding myself comparing it to Behind Strong Walls.
Yeah,
differently, obviously.
It's
kind of defense, but it is
kind of the same principle, just the other way around.
Yes,
it's for attack instead of defense, and Behind Strong Walls is a great card. So yeah, this allows you to potentially kill 2 enemies instead of 1. That's worth it. If you have lots of tactics resources, then you can recur it and do it multiple times, but most of the time you won't actually need to do that. Clearly, this works very well with Hurin. It also works very well with Excellion. It's another way that you can boost his attack. So if you have a 4 hit point enemy and a 5 hit point enemy, he can kill 1. You play Day Shall Come Again. He readies with 5 attack, and you can kill the 5 hit point enemy. Those are the obvious possibilities. Perhaps also Huan. After you trigger his ability to give him +5 attack, you can then get multiple attacks out of him by playing Day Shall Come Again and kill off all your enemies before you have to discard him. Those are the obvious choices.
Yes,
There are clearly other possibilities. We don't have to use tactics characters, but I'm not about to go through all of the cards from the other spheres again.
Broadly speaking, any decent attacker getting another action out of them is always going to be useful.
Yeah.
And it
Perhaps
doesn't have any kind of trait requirement.
Yeah,
it just
perhaps
needs to be
more
apparently you
notable
control.
for allies, because you can't give them readying effects like Unexpected Courage, but also heroes, because there are less attack boosts in the first stage than otherwise, and they are often the better attackers. That concludes all of the tactics cards from the first stage. Thank you for watching and listening. We'll be moving on to the lore and neutral cards for the next video, which will conclude all the card reviews. Thank you and goodbye.